Hello everyone. Welcome to this video on loneliness versus alienation. What is the difference? How do we define them? And how do we move forward in our lives? I'm Trevor Jin, and today I'm joined by a special friend, a special guest, Dr. Peter Malinoski. Dr. Malinoski, do you want to explain who you are?
Sure, I'll explain myself. And what am I doing here?
Yeah.
I'm a clinical psychologist in Indiana, in Indianapolis, and I've been doing work with really grounding the practice of psychology in a Catholic worldview for the last 19 years. That's where my passion really is. It's about taking the best of psychology and really grounding it in a Catholic anthropology. So that's what floats my boat, and it's really important in topics like what we're discussing today, and loneliness and alienation. And the interesting thing is that I'm now starting to bring this out onto the web. So it's great to be able to be here with you today, Trevor, and to be with this entire Focus audience. I have a special place in my heart for Focus, and it's a pleasure and an honor.
Awesome. So. And what strikes me about your work and the things you do with Souls and Hearts, your organization, is it unites these two things that I feel like are constantly separated: the spirituality of Catholicism, the prayer life. You hear all about that, but then off the very reality of what we know about the science of the brain and clinical psychology, those things are just almost always separated. And I just want those viewing right now, before we even jump into the topic, to know that not only is it possible for those to be united, but they absolutely should be. So in this particular way, I'm so excited for you to walk us through how those unite when it comes to loneliness versus alienation and how we move forward from that.
Yeah, I mean, St. Thomas Aquinas said that grace perfects nature, right? It does not destroy it. So we're really all about, at Souls and Hearts, and my clinical work also, about shoring up that natural foundation, really making that natural foundation strong for the spiritual life to be built upon. So that's really what we're looking at here, both at soulsandhearts.com and also today in this video. That permeates all that I do. So
great. And so let's just dive right in. So these two concepts, loneliness and alienation, what I've seen online and what psychologists talk about, usually these things are made synonymous, right, to mean the same thing, that I'm feeling lonely, therefore I'm alienated. But you say that there's a key difference between these two, right?
It's really an important difference. And not distinguishing the difference causes a tremendous amount of problems for people. So the first thing that I'm going to talk about is how loneliness is an emotion, right? It's a subjective state. That means that it doesn't necessarily correspond to an objective place of being, right? That's alienation. Alienation is an objective state of being. Loneliness is a feeling, right? And they don't always match up. You could be alienated, for example, Trevor, but not feel lonely, right? Or you could feel lonely, but actually be close in relationship with somebody, with God, for example. And so ferreting those things out, kind of teasing that out and understanding that it's absolutely critical to being able to respond in a way that's helpful.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. So you can have that emotion of loneliness. I know I felt it in my life, even though I'm surrounded by, when I was on campus, awesome teammates, awesome community, even prayer life. I'm there with God, but the emotions are still there. And I'm confused, and it's like, am I doing something wrong? But what I'm hearing you say is that there's a difference between the feeling and the objective reality.
Reality.
Are you saying that the objective reality is something we need to dial in on, and the emotions maybe not as much? Or what are you,
well, I think we want to pay attention to both, but we want to be thoughtful about, like, how do we go about how do we take action, right? Because what most people are going to key in on is the feeling. That's what we sense, right? So that's where our focus tends to be. So I want to get rid of this feeling of loneliness. And we don't as much focus in on alienation. So let me give you an example, right? Somebody who is in an objective state of mortal sin because they just had sex with their girlfriend, full knowledge, full consent, right? All the conditions are there. They might in that moment feel really close, not lonely at all, right? Actually not, but they might be both alienated from their girlfriend, but also from God, right? They would be alienated from God, right? Because the objective state of mortal sin, the relationship's broken, right? Even though it doesn't feel that way. This is part of the broader context of subjectivism, this idea of like what I feel to be true must be true. Right. This is something that's a real problem in our modernist culture. We tend to place so much weight on that, and we've lost a sense of what's actually real. So now we can wind up redefining anything, right? Redefining what marriage is, redefining, anything, because we're the arbiters of what's real or what's not. That's the real pernicious place that we're in philosophically, and that doesn't correspond with what the actual reality is. I mean, there's a whole school of of psychological thought, philosophical thought, subjectivism that says basically our reality is what we make it to be.
Right. And does that pair well with just how love itself, it's just usually a loaded word, but now with just any type of definition you want for love, usually associated with feelings, like I feel love for you, therefore that is what love is. And it just seems to me it's often that the objective part of love, the objective realities of what love actually is just taken out of the equation. Whether or not something is truly love or not is just kind of incidental, and it's really all about the feelings. And if the feelings go away, I guess I don't love this person anymore. Would you say that relates?
That's exactly the kind of thing that I'm talking about. So, for example, in the Book of Judges, where I'm actually doing a fair amount of study right now with my men's group, Samson sees a Philistine woman, and he falls in love with her, and he says she is right in my eyes. His parents are trying to get him not to marry her. She's a Philistine. Can't we find somebody in our own tribe, or at least in the people of Israel? No, I'm going to marry her. She's right in my eyes. And that statement, right in my eyes, as opposed to being right in God's eyes, right, is something that permeates Judges, and it leads to a lot of infidelity among the Israelites in that period of time. So we actually want to rely on the objective standards that God has revealed to us through his church, right? Through scripture, through the tradition, rather than just go with our own lights. Because what does Isaiah 55 say? Your ways are not my ways, and your thoughts are not my thoughts. And we have to be humble enough to accept that and not just go with what we happen to feel in the moment. So loneliness is the feeling, alienation is the actual objective reality. And so what we're gonna move to is like, okay, let's address the alienation. That's the thing that really needs the focus, because there can be times where you're deeply in relationship, right? For example, in a dark night of the soul, or in a period of spiritual dryness, or in a period of desolation, where you're going to be lonely. It's going to happen. And there's no sin in that. Jesus was lonely, right? In the Garden of Gethsemane. Could you not watch with me for 1 hour, right? Or even on the cross, right? Reciting Psalm 22, the first line, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? He was like us in all things but sin. He experienced these things. There's not necessarily any disorder in feeling lonely. That's part of our human condition. Right. But there is disorder in alienation, especially from God, and especially from those who we are called to be in relationship with, if that alienation exists on our end, right? Obviously, sometimes we can't always connect. So,
and with loneliness, whenever I've felt it, I've talked with my fellow friends, fellow brothers about this, it's often actually been a very good thing for me, because when I'm lonely and I'm feeling that, it's a sign that there's something outside of myself that I should be going after. Oftentimes, even when I'm just like among friends, I remember when I first moved to a new city, I had this amazing job, new friends, I was doing all these fun outdoorsy stuff, which I love, but I was not making time for God. And I had this feeling of loneliness, and I'm like, this sucks. Why am I feeling this if everything else is going well in my life? Or so I thought, and it reminded me, this loneliness is pointing me to something higher. This loneliness is pointing me to something outside of myself. And I'd say the same thing goes with friends. If I'm not making time for them, or just sticking to myself too much, I have that feeling of loneliness, but in a good way, in my experience.
One of the things that I think is really creating, because levels of loneliness right now are skyrocketing, right?
Yes.
We're in the middle of a pandemic. People's routines have shut down in a lot of ways. Things have only started opening back up, and so there's a lot of disruption in people's routines and what they're familiar with and connecting with family, friends. We got social distancing, masks, the whole 9 yards, all kinds of things like that. But what I think is the bigger problem is the alienation, right? People are not relating in the same way. There's been more going to, social media types of things, trying to relate online. And not all of that is bad, but one has to be thoughtful about what's the nature of the relating, right? And is there authentic connection here? Or am I substituting something that's not going to actually address alienation? Because you can have 16,000 Facebook likes and it's not going to make up for real relating, or
Right.
however many Twitter followers or any of those things like that. So I think what we've got is much more of an alienation problem than we have a loneliness problem. Because if you are alienated, sooner or later the loneliness is going to come. That's guaranteed. And if you're connected, sooner or later the sense of being connected, that visceral sense, is going to come back, even if you happen to be in a place of desolation where our Lord is sharpening your desire for Him, right? Mm-hmm. Like increasing that. That's going to remit. It may take some time. If you're like a big saint, like a Mother Teresa, it might take a while, but it's going to come. You're going to have a sense of peace in it, right? Yes. So one can be lonely and peaceful, but one can't really be alienated and peaceful. So the sense of peace is one of those barometers by which, as a clinician, I will measure what's actually going on here. And then, of course, it's really important to be doing your examinations of conscience, to be headed to confession, to make sure that you're actually not separated, from God, and able to receive those graces and so forth. And I tell you that not as a Catholic as much as a psychologist, right? Sure. Because I want there to be this order, right, in the natural realm, so that the spiritual life can have that solid foundation.
Yeah, it sounds to me like in the example I used a few minutes earlier, that the loneliness and the way that it was good because it was directing me and showing me some objective alienation in my life.
Right.
And so in that way, the loneliness was a good vehicle. But from what I'm hearing, loneliness can also just happen even if you're not actually alienated, and that's normal, and that's fine too.
And that's normal. Yeah, and that's normal, and that's good. And that, and for example, it can also lead us to really rely on God when we might be tempted to rely on some other person, right? And put too much emphasis on that relationship, try to have it meet needs that only God can meet, that kind of thing. So.
Great. So would you be able to unpack alienation a little further? I heard a few different types of it. Well, for example, alienation from God and alienation from other people around. Can you unpack those different types?
Yeah. So I would say that there's kind of three types of alienation. And the first would be one that most people would think of, like alienation from others, right? I'm not connected with other people. I'm spending too much time in my dorm room. I'm not going out, that kind of thing. I'm disconnected from other people. The second type of alienation is one that you might not think about as much, but that is alienation from myself, right? This is where I'm disconnected from me. And how does that happen, right? Well, I want you to think, Trevor, we have the second great commandment, to love your neighbor as yourself. Right? So what does that mean? That implies that we're supposed to love ourselves. And that implies that somehow we're supposed to be in relationship with ourselves. Right. And so when we are struggling with alienation from self, that means we don't know ourselves. We're not connecting with ourselves. We're not in relationship with ourselves. We're distracted. We're on Netflix binge. We're looking at porn. Whatever the coping mechanisms that we use to deal with alienation, those are prominent. We're actually not connected with ourselves. And then the third one is alienation from God. Right. And that one has all kinds of implications for the other two. Right. So these are all actually related.
How is there a practical way for our viewers to address alienation for example, is there some type of method or something they can bring to prayer to be able to just see if there's alienation in their lives? What would you recommend?
I would actually take an inventory of your relationships, right? And how you're connected with, first of all, other people, right? Because that's probably the easiest one to look at. Like I said, the example of the college student who's in her dorm room, hasn't connected with anybody for 3 days. All classes are online. And it's, so you can kind of get that. Then I would look at alienation from God, and the number one indicator of this is prayer, right? Are you setting aside the time for prayer? Dedicated for prayer for God. Now, it's fine to pray while you're driving, but you shouldn't drive while you're praying. Okay, so there's a difference there. This is the dedicated time for relating with God, and it might be really dry. Prayer is actually much harder than it might look, and if you're not experiencing a lot of like emotional kind of happy feelings or positive feelings about it, the tendency can be to say, "I'm doing it wrong. I'm going to give it up." And that's a huge mistake. So we want to take a look at where we are with a prayer life. And then the third thing is, how much am I connecting with myself? Like, am I asking myself questions? Like, how am I doing today? Right? You can talk to yourself as you would a close friend. Right. And so that's one way to really start getting into how connected am I to myself. I think that there's a tremendous amount of internal disconnect. And if it gets more extreme, it's called dissociation. But I would argue that most people in our cultures do not know themselves very well, and that compromises their capacity to love themselves in an ordered way.
Yeah, and I just have to interject to add on to what you're saying. This is so important for us to do this for ourselves. But I remember when I was a focus missionary on campus, this was a very clear paradigm, which I'm now learning is a real thing, where I would encounter students, both people involved with their faith, total strangers on campus, and they were just exuding alienation. It was just so obvious. And it just felt like my witness, at the very least, with connecting with them, befriending them, getting to know them, was fighting directly against this very obvious alienation. And in a way, it helped me, too, with my own alienation, because I was connecting with them in friendship. But basically, what I'm just seeing from this is not only are we individually dealing with this, and we should deal with it, we should take the time to do that, but that means everyone else that you encounter, even your close family members, close friends, are dealing with these different types of alienations, like just alienation from God. That's obviously the big one that gets the most press. You've mentioned alienation from others. That one's very easy to see externally, and especially that alienation from self. And I just feel that when we're doing mission, whether it be college campus or a parish, this could be a very, very helpful way for us to help them and to see tangible results, tangible ways that we can help them.
And God's got a plan for you not to be alienated. Okay.
Right.
Sometimes people look at it like, hey, there's nothing I can do. My situation is pretty bleak. I'm on a military base somewhere. There's not a lot of capacity for social interactions, or, the campus is shut down. We're all in our dorm rooms. We can't even go to class. Everything's remote. God's got a plan for all of that. And, and it can be online. For example, in Souls and Hearts, we've just started up what's called the Resilient Catholics Carpe Diem community that sees the day. That grew up around the podcast that I do, Coronavirus Crisis Carpe Diem. And you can check that all out on soulsandhearts.com. But that community is very active in learning how to tolerate being known, being loved. The interactions online are pretty amazing, actually. We do some video work together where we practice different kinds of prayer and so forth. But it's all about overcoming that alienation, overcoming distorted God images. You and I have talked about God images in the past. It's about being able to connect and know yourself too, with the help of a supportive community. So there are resources even online that can help Catholics that really are interested in overcoming alienation, and the loneliness will follow. We tend, it's just like, you want to be careful, right? When you're dealing with somebody who's sick, you don't want to just focus on the fever. The fever isn't the problem, right? It's whatever the underlying infection is. And in this case, right, when there's alienation, there's going to be a fever eventually, right? We want to make sure that we're actually dealing with the underlying root cause. So.
Yeah, that is great. And for everyone watching, we will put all of those links to Dr. Malinoski's stuff that he mentioned in the description below, wherever you're watching this. I recommend him so highly. Please go check out his work. If the things in this video resonated with you, even on a cursory level, he has so many resources through his podcast, through that RCCD community that he mentioned. Go check it out. Dr. Malinoski, thank you so much for your time for this video. This was very helpful.
It's been great to be here with you, Trevor, and it's been great to be with this whole Focus audience. Like I said, I've got a very soft spot in my heart for Focus. I've known Dr. Sri for, since 1992, for many, many years, many more years than I might want to acknowledge as far as how old I am. But yet it's been great to be here with you. So
great, and we are praying for you all.